Thank you very much, Felicity, and thank you for my wife and family for supporting me, and a massive thank you to Rabobank. Without your support, this research wouldn't have been able to happen. Before I start though, can I get a show of hands from everyone here if you experience the same weather patterns year in, year out on your property or farm? So, same rainfall totals? Anyone? Yes, you. I'm moving there. And that's it, my speech done. So, but no. Can we consistently run the same numbers of animals or plant the same crops year in, year out? Probably not, but many of us try to. At good old Cunnamulla in southwest Queensland, our place averaged 13 inches or 330 mils per year. The property could run about 8 to 10,000 head of dry sheep on average, but since the year 2000, I think that place averaged maybe about 7 to 9 inches of rain per year, with the odd abnormality of about 20 to 26 inches, which directly influenced our long-term average. The stock numbers typically reflected this trend, as did our cash flow. Now, hands up from the crowd if you'd like to see some form of on-farm consistency. Great. Because if we can get some reliability in our pastures, we'd all be better off physically, mentally, and financially. At the thought of that, you can almost feel the room calming at that unrealistic or typically unrealistic notion. But it's just that was the motivation for my topic, managing pastures for seasonal variation. Through talking with producers, both here and abroad, I found three key areas of influence within our grazing environment that, if given enough attention, would see our soil health improve, allowing the flow-on effects to both positively influence our end product, our livestock, and our crops. Here, I believe we can achieve some semblance to that desired consistency, and they include, I'm way off, natural water function. So this is where we want to turn our soils into basically a giant sponge that can soak up and hold water for long periods of time. So in turn, allow primary producers to better sustain plants and pastures between rain events, reducing runoff at the same time. It was here that I focused on both artificial methods, so ponding, deep ripping, etc., and natural methods, so soil organic matter, which is a massive one, livestock intervention, pasture management, and the selective use of trees. These slow the water flow and allow for better water infiltration and reduced excessive evaporation. Now, a really fun fact, and this sort of ties into Ian's biodiversity, for every increase in soil organic carbon, your soil increases its water holding capacity by 168,000 litres per hectare. This also increases the accuracy of your rain gauge, which only tells you what has fallen and not what has actually soaked in. Then there's the biodiversity. Here we want a variety of plants and animals to essentially mimic nature. Nature can do a better job of it than we can, I believe. And different plants perform different roles. So, for example, legumes suck nitrogen out of the air, while chicory can source both copper and calcium from deep below for both your livestock and surrounding plants. These animals graze differently to each other as well, and will heavily influence what does and doesn't grow in your pasture. They also provide different forms of manure. Fun fact, especially for the goat producers in the room, goats have such nutrient-dense droppings that they provide 5 times the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium of a beast. So, regarding that, and combining what we know regarding the abilities of different plants and animals, this allows us to start creating that giant, spongy, in-ground dam that is our safety net in drier times. And finally, my favourite, grazing management. Each with their pros and cons, different grazing methods will directly influence the plants and soils around them, which can make or break the biodiversity and water function of the landscape they're grazing. For example, our smallest paddock, only a tiny paddock, which is 260 acres in Cunnamulla, gets smashed sporadically throughout the year, acting as a major holding paddock for our sheep and goat musters. In November last year, it held 6,000 goats for a few days before holding another 8,000 in May. This paddock has only been in use for around 2 years, and since its inception, the observer can clearly see the dominant weeds being replaced in favour of desirable grasses, native emetics, and native legumes. It's a rough, accidental form of holistic grazing, but it is working. I've kept jumping between these three topics, water function, biodiversity and grazing management, wondering which was the biggest driver in soil health, but I soon realised you can't single one out as they're so intertwined. Plant monocultures create a nutritional imbalance in the soil that will eventually require supplementation. Livestock, if left to their own devices, will eventually graze out their favourites, leaving undesirable plants behind. Meanwhile, bare earth creates more bare earth via increased runoff, soil capping from rain droplets, and increased exposure from the elements, allowing it to either cook or freeze. Ultimately, soils that are bursting with life and healthy, full of organic material, and they're the without those, we lose that desired consistency that we're after. So with that said, without living soil, our plants can grow, and so can our livestock. Therefore, no life, no livestock. Thank you.
We'll just stay up here and have a little chat. It's my favourite thing when they let me hog the conversation before everyone else gets to join in. So you guys get to hold your questions because we're going to have just a little bit more of a chat for 5 minutes. So in the little break before, you and I talked a bit about productivity because we were talking about the challenge, and I'm sure, no one in this room has a cash flow problem, do they? Everyone's just like, yeah, it's totally fine. But for those of us, those very few of us who might be thinking about how we manage our productivity, what is your advice in that space when we are a little bit dictated to by our cash flow and we're trying to still get the balancing act you described just right?
Yeah, well, that balancing act is really key. So I suppose to maintain that productivity, it's really tricky, particularly when you hit a dry time or even a good time, because you want to hold on to your animals and that affects your cash flow through reduced selling. Vice versa, when you hit a dry time, the normal instance is to sell everything and then you lose your cash flow again. So really, it's all about balancing your cash flow, balancing your stocking rate to your carrying capacity. So as things get dry, you sell off, but you constantly match it to what your place can physically run. And at the same time, if things do turn around, instead of going out and buying straight away, maybe look at adjusting, maybe try trading some steers or something like that to try and keep that cash flow going, because it's bloody hard to try and get that right. You can't, as I think Ian told me in Canada, where he is, you can't go green if you're in the red. So you really got to try and do everything you can to maintain it, because cash flow is king. So as long as you can maintain that fluidity in your livestock, particularly, I can't speak from a cropping angle, it's a bit trickier, but particularly with livestock.
Nor can I, we'll let other people do that.
It's just about getting that right, yeah.
So, and when you maybe are coming into new land, so if you're on land that you maybe had your parents, your grandparents on, you're going to be fairly familiar with the way that land behaves with different conditions. Are there any shortcuts that you can think of if you're coming into new land, whether you're leasing it or you've bought it, and you're trying to figure out, well, what is the carrying capacity in this environment? What can I see here? Were there any tools that you would suggest people can use if they're trying to bring themselves up to speed relatively quickly on the way that land is going to behave in seasonal variability?
Yeah, well, I'm actually going through that right now in Crookle and Gunning down in New South Wales, so that's a big challenge. But there's grazing charts, there's AgriWeb, My Grazing, all those sort of things. But also too, it's about identifying and observing and using that intuition to guide you at the same time. So you'll be constantly looking at what the stock are going forward, identifying their manure. So if it's runny, there's not enough fibre. If it's rock hard, there's not enough nutrients in there. There's not enough wet feed. So it's about identifying and observing what's happening. But going forward, every time you go into a paddock, you look at what they're going into and what they've left behind. And if you see that the next paddock has nothing left, you go, right, I'm clearly running too many. Or if you go to the next one and you've got 3 metres of feed ahead of you, you're obviously not stocking it heavily enough. So it's all about trying to watch what you're going into, and that helps.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We might leave it there and we will come back to you very shortly with the whole group. So thank you very much.
Thank you.